My name's Chris Hardie. I work at UK Atomic Energy Authority, where we are striving to develop commercial fusion power for our energy source. And I'll be talking about prediction of materials response in uncharted fusion environments. And just to state the obvious, I suppose that a lot of the work that I'm presenting is not all mine. It's a kind of contribution from all of my excellent colleagues and collaborators, particularly listed here in the University of Oxford and Imperial. Okay, so I'll start a bit about describing the context of what we're trying to do. Essentially, nuclear fusion doesn't exist yet today. However, it promises to provide high levels of power in small spaces, which mean extreme environments of heat fluxes and irradiation, and to a large extent, environments that are yet to be seen on Earth. In particular, for fusion, we have a high energy intense neutron source, up to 14 MeV neutrons. And the take-home message of the problem is that physically testing materials subject to these extreme conditions is difficult, if not impossible, given that it's yet to be seen on Earth. So what do we know so far? We were fortunate enough to host the largest sort of fusion tokamak experiment in the world, JET, which runs in Oxfordshire and is now in a state of decommissioning after many successful decades of operation. And despite it achieving world records in fusion power production, it actually exposed the materials to very non-fusion type environments to a large extent, where the irradiation damage and transmutation gas production that is produced in the materials in operation was negligible. In the south of France, ITER is currently under construction. However, this is still an experimental reactor and therefore is not deemed to expose materials to power plant relevant damage and material extreme environment. However, we are now in a state of trying to design and conceptualize reactors for power plants. Now, in the world, this is commonly termed demo, and within the UK, our domestic effort is called STEP, and that's just the name of the prototype power plant that we're trying to produce, which will expose materials to environments that are yet to be seen. So this is the uncharted territory. So we don't know a lot, but what we do know is largely based from what we've learned in the fission world. And so here is a series of metals and alloys. So zirconium-based copper, nickel-based steels, vanadium-based and titanium-based alloys. And they all show some things in common after subjected to very small levels of exposure to irradiation. So they change from a good structural alloy with good levels of work hardening and ductility to something that has very little ductility at all. So it hardens, it instantly necks on yield in many cases, and has very little ductility. And if I was a sort of design engineer building plant, this would sort of keep me awake at night. This is a concerning change in the material properties. So we are very limited in what we can learn about materials exposed to these environments today. And some of the best we can do is expose them into current fission-based materials test reactors. That's the MTRs I've described in the title here. So just to explain the problem a bit, this is a sort of tongue-in-cheek back-of-the-envelope calculation. If we were just to take a given material, let's, for example, say baseline steel, and we were only interested in failure due to monotonic loading, you might want to test two types or conduct two types of tests, maybe fracture toughness and tensile testing over a range of temperatures and doses. And just to get some information about that material subject to a fission environment, it is on the order of sort of 480 samples and about 8 years from first kind of needing information to exposing that material in a reactor and getting testing done on it. And it's on the order of several million, again, sort of a tongue-in-cheek kind of back-of-the-envelope calculation, but it's hugely expensive. Now, the problem with that is that's just one material type, which is baseline, doesn't include welds and other joints or different heat treatments. And it's only failure due to monotonic loading. It doesn't include the far more expensive time-dependent failure of creep and fatigue. And the other sort of caveats to do with this is that fission test reactors aren't representative of the fusion environment. So the neutron energies are much lower, and often the fluxes that we can expose materials to are a lot smaller as well. It is the best we can do, but do we just assume it's good enough? The other caveat is that in nearly all nuclear technologies, the materials aren't irradiated and then tested. They are subject to simultaneous loading at temperature, irradiation, stresses, potentially in the presence of magnetic fields, hydrogen, and other corrosive media. So really, these sort of simplified tests only can tell us so much. So we need to take what we can do experimentally and extrapolate to fusion. And so this is where I sort of turn to describing what modeling and simulation can do. And we have a new project within UK. It's one of a much broader range of modeling based projects that asks a very simple question, which is, if we can define a model at the right length scale, which can describe how a material deforms and how it fails, can we unpick the myriad of failure mechanisms that we're concerned about with our materials in service? And the other element of our project, which is somewhat unique, is that if it's unirradiated, we're not too concerned because you can test it a bit easier. So we focus a lot on the influence of irradiation. So rather than the sort of conventional approach of multi-scale modeling, our project is considering more of a top-down approach. So we take the tried and tested finite element analysis of components, which is accepted by nuclear regulators and stakeholders, and we take that same technology one length scale step down. So rather than modeling components, we're now modeling microstructures, and we're interested in finite element analysis and crystal plasticity, finite element methods, and other complementary techniques within the finite element package that we can apply to best represent the deformation and failure of microstructures. And so this was an early idea, and the thing that kind of give it traction at UKAA was this case study that we run. Now this is on zircaloy 4, which is a fission cladding material, but due to the wealth of data available at the time on this, we decided to run a case study on this. So on the left, we can see in the data points stress strain responses measured by experiment of zircaloy 4 in the unirradiated, the slightly irradiated or lightly irradiated, and then the more heavily irradiated condition. And we can see that effect where the irradiation hardens the material, but it instantly softens after yield. And we could, to cut a very long story short, we could calibrate our crystal plasticity model with this representative volume element to represent what's seen experimentally there. And then taking that model with a single set of parameters and not changing it at all, we could directly simulate experiments, and this is on the right now. And these experiments are just tensile testing, so the same type of testing, but instead of worrying about stress strain, we're looking at the strain heterogeneity in zircaloy 4 that's measured by high resolution digital image correlation. So we can see the bottom row is unirradiated and the top row is irradiated. The striking difference that is there due in the strain heterogeneity, so strain localization is a big difference after irradiation. And on the right column, we can see that the simulation, to some extent, represents what we see experimentally without changing the model. So this gives us confidence. It's not perfect, but it gives us confidence that this might be the correct modeling platform to use to develop predictive capabilities. So from the back of that success, we started a project called Design by Fundamentals, which is essentially dedicated to the development of a experiment and modeling pipeline to develop predictive tools. So it goes from sort of the development of theory and implementation of that theory into model in this sort of C1 red box, all the way through to calibrating and validating these models with the sort of state-of-the-art experimentation, some of which I've just shown, and then through to simulation of representative volume elements. These are just large blocks of enough microstructure that we consider them representative of the bulk materials, in order to provide this sort of predictive capability that we can then expose these in the virtual world, expose these boxes to different conditions of irradiation, temperature, and stress, and tell engineers what the bulk material behavior might be. And so over the last couple of years, my team has been developing this pipeline and the capabilities. And so for the next half of this talk, I'll just describe where we are with these different capabilities. So first and foremost, given that we're trying to develop a crystal plasticity sort of framework for prediction, we've actually rewritten an entire crystal plasticity code in the form of an Abacus user material. And this is available on GitHub, so you can see the link at the top here. This is a lot more cleaner of a code compared to many that's available, and it's in modular form with a simple input structure, and it's very easy therefore to bolt on additions and change things. It is quite efficient, so we've got comparisons now between this code and others showing that there is some good efficiency with the simulations. And part of that is that we've done a lot of work in developing more robust and efficient nonlinear solvers. And so some of these graphs on the right here show evidence of speed up due to making the solvers more efficient, which is particularly useful when we're simulating the effects of irradiation, because the material properties just become more nonlinear and difficult to solve. And then we're developing this as we speak. We're developing it further. So the latest things that we're focused on now are the development of cohesive zone elements for modeling interface sliding and fracture, and implementing different hardening mechanisms to better capture the material's response for cyclic loading, for example, and other types of loading. Moving forward, we're then looking at developing or improving techniques to best calibrate these crystal plasticity models. And one way to do this is to make the mechanical test so small that you can test individual grains in a polycrystalline sample. So on the right is a video showing a micropillar compression test in pure copper. And my colleague Luke has developed a means of doing the same high-res digital image correlation on the surface of this very miniature beam. So I don't know if it's possible to see, but the scale bar on that video is 5 microns. So these are very small tests, and we can map the strain evolution on the surface of the micropillar. And more importantly, we can correct then for all of the misalignments and compliance in the system to get accurate data from it. So the conventional way of doing things is to trust in the indented displacement. But if we were to do that, we would measure much far more unrealistic elastic modulus, and therefore other properties, compared to having this correction. And then in linking with that, calibrating models, we're developing the constitutive equations to provide for much more representative simulations in terms of the strain heterogeneity and the stochastic nature of slip at the single crystal grain scale. Then going up a length scale, once we're pleased that we have a model that represents the single crystal deformation behavior, we look at how the polycrystalline aggregates deform. And here is just another example of the experimental data we've produced. So again, this is an example of high resolution digital image correlation. We've developed patterning techniques that can do this to sensitive materials that are robust against irradiation, because we're interested in irradiating the samples before and during testing. And also that is transparent to EBSD techniques in the scanning electron microscope. And this is just some example data sets on pure copper and copper chrome zirconium. And it shows how the deformation isn't simple, and the deformation mechanisms that we need to represent in our models are quite diverse. And here's just unpicking a few different mechanisms here at the bottom: planar, single slip, grain boundary localization, and potentially sliding, and so on. And we can do this not just as a single snapshot after deformation, but as a far better sort of function of time, or more directly as a function of strain. So this just shows a polycrystalline copper sample being deformed as a function of high resolution and strain, and seeing how those different deformation mechanisms evolve through that experiment. And of course, we can do a similar thing where we zoom into different regions of interest and see how the different deformation mechanisms evolve with strain and how they interact with each other. Again, really important for validating our models. Not only can we do this as a function of strain, but also as a function of temperature and of microstructure. So just, I won't dwell on this slide for the interest of time, but just to show that we can do this on different variants of steel. So in this case, a sort of coarser microstructure steel versus a finer microstructure. And as a function of temperature up to 375 in this case, looking at the effect that temperature has on the deformation mechanisms and ensuring that we can represent that in modeling. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we're really focused on the influence of irradiation because that's the bit that we must understand the best in order to predict what will happen in a fusion irradiation environment. So we've made some progress in developing a bespoke rig that is used at the Dalton Cumbria facility, the proton ion beam. Here is a chamber with a load frame that we can attach to the beam line. And as such, we can have a tensile specimen at temperature and under stress, and we can irradiate that and observe what happens. So this has only just been built and is largely commissioned. And this is a very first data set from that rig showing a test under irradiation where we've loaded the specimen, it's yielded, and then we've unloaded. And as we've unloaded, the material, it has an increase or is still exposed to irradiation. And when we reload, we can see that there is an increase in the flow stress, which we attribute to the accumulation of dose during that unload period. And so the irradiation hardening that's happened. And just to mention here that we've got a PhD student who's just started that's dedicated to modeling these effects. And then this is some example data from that experiment or additional experiments. So we've got grade 91 steel on the far left, and then the strain heterogeneity after irradiation to 0.1 dPa. So this is what we call cook and look. We've irradiated to a certain dose. It doesn't matter about the units of that dose. And when we've tested the material, it's showing that sort of localization but it's a bit more robust compared to the Zirc alloy 4. And then looking at what happens when we deform the material under irradiation, which is far more representative of the fusion environment and all nuclear environments that are of interest to us, and showing the slightly different effects that can have. So this is really quite early work to develop information for our models, but it's yielding some interesting results already. And then finally, in terms of the sort of pipeline capability development, we've developed a lot of sort of software and computer code to provide finite element models that truly represent the materials of interest. So on the left is just a sort of pipeline where we can take all of that data that I've shown, the high resolution DIC stitched with EBSD experimental data set, and import all of the correct grain boundary morphologies and orientations into a crystal plasticity finite element model. And on the right, we've also developed representation of our microstructures virtually. So these we call synthetic microstructures. They're just made, and we have tools and code to quantify how representative our virtual microstructures are compared to our experimentally characterized microstructures. And we are looking to qualify these representative volume elements, these blocks of virtual microstructures, as representative so that we can use them for sort of in silico testing to predict mechanical properties for our engineers. And then finally, this is just putting all of that together. So stitching all of that capability together, and we've done an early kind of proof of concept of how we take the single crystal data, how we take the polycrystalline data and develop systematically a calibrated model through to prediction of macro scale properties. To the very right hand side, we've got a stress strain response from experiment, and we've got a simulation, and they to some extent agree. However, what I would say is this is extremely early days for us, and there's plenty more that we can improve upon here. And so just to summarize, I've described the challenge that we have in fusion and what we're doing in terms of modeling and simulation to try and complement and help with the testing that we're doing, and then just reviewed the pipeline that what we're developing in order to take on that work. And with that, there's a few references which can be looked at on a catch-up. Thanks for your attention.